fairness to Yellen or anyone who's Treasury Secretary, your job is the US dollar. I think that it's been about CBDC since day one, and there's no surprise to that. If you go back to some of Yellen's comments early on, she has said she thinks that CBDC is the answer. In fact, Powell has testified saying he thinks if we introduced a CBDC, it would make the stable coins and other cryptocurrencies probably, reduce in their value and reduce in their purpose. Hopefully, like maybe Bitcoin becomes that pharmaceutical drug that they realize is the right way to approach foreign policy, because the way we do sanctions now, and I mean, I know you just said Alex Gladstein on it, so that's his I don't want to steal anything from him, but it really is pretty awful. It's almost like when we used to have people who had anxiety issues, the answer was, well, just do a lobotomy. If you think about it, like we have a problem with another country, we're just gonna make everybody in that country starve, even if like 99% of the people aren't responsible. And that's really rough. And that's the way we're using the dollar now. It's weaponizing the money that we have in our system.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you like and comment below. And to find future episodes in your feed and push notifications, make sure you subscribe. And if you click the little bell, you'll get every new episode as it's released. Thanks again for watching. Today, I'm sitting down with Jason Brett. Jason is a former U.S. regulator who served at the FDIC during the global financial crisis of 2008 in capital markets. With 20 years experience in financial services, Jason went on in 2016 to work in the cryptocurrency space, first starting at the Chamber of Digital Commerce and then advising some of the leading firms on government and regulatory strategies. Jason founded the Value Technology Foundation, a 501c3 in 2019 that seeks to educate policymakers and regulators on Bitcoin and blockchain technology. In today's conversation, we discuss President Biden's recent executive order issued on March 9th, which tasked experts across federal government with conducting in-depth analysis of cryptocurrencies, and we also discuss other recent related matters surrounding the executive order. So with that said, let's dive in with Jason Brett. Hey guys, I'm going to take a quick pause to introduce the first sponsor on the Jay Gould Show. I am happy and proud to say that this show is now sponsored by Withum, Smith & Brown, which is a forward-thinking, technology-driven advisory and accounting firm that is committed to helping big and small companies be more profitable, efficient, and productive in today's complex business environment. Withum now also has a dedicated crypto and blockchain technology team to help early-stage businesses properly navigate all the crypto tax-related matters. I've been using Withum both personally and professionally for nearly a decade for all of my business's personal needs as well. I'm very happy with them and I highly recommend Withum. You can contact Withum by visiting their website at withum.com. Now back to the show. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jay. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for finally getting on here. We've been talking about this for months. It's very topical because what's going on in the world, to have you on the show and everything that, your relevant experience in the background. We talk about these things, guys like me and Preston, but you're the expert. So we should talk about regulation, where we're at, where the government's at, how that may or may not impact Bitcoin moving forward. But before we do any of that, I'd like to start off with your background. If you could just tell everybody about, where you're from, where you grew up, kind of your socioeconomic conditions, what your parents did for a living. I just want to know more about Jason. So tell us about you.
Yeah, so I grew up in Haworth, New Jersey, North Jersey. My dad was a pharmacist. My mom was a middle school teacher and taught Spanish, actually. So I was an only child, but I went to a private school because my mom was a teacher in that school, so we were able to afford that. And then I worked really hard in school. I got into Cornell University and went to, it was a really good school there where I studied government, political science. And I kind of thought I wanted to be like a lawyer, but I realized very quickly I didn't have the patience for that. So I went on to get into the financial investment world. So I was a stockbroker at Morgan Stanley for a couple of years in New York. And then I ended up working at Bank of America, really understanding and I started thinking a lot about how people process the decision to buy financial products. So I worked also at an insurance company to see there's sort of the sales of insurance and what the goals are for an insurance salesman, what the goals are for a banker, and then what the goals are if you're buying stocks. And as you know, they all kind of come at you from different angles with different, incentive mechanisms. So I went back to my MBA thinking about all these different ways that consumers get products. And then I ended up in the middle of the financial crisis because my internship was with the FDIC over the summer. And so before I knew it, I got this whole new skill set of dealing with different banks that were failing, being involved in that crisis. And that's sort of where my whole career into the financial world really took off. And then from there has led into this new world, which is really interesting too.
How did you get into Bitcoin? What's your origin story on that?
Yeah. So in 2016, I found out about Bitcoin working at the Chamber of Digital Commerce. It was a job I took. I had been through the financial crisis, and I was mainly working for consulting firms, helping with like different agencies like FDIC, OCC, and I had this opportunity where I was working with firms who were doing different things in the space. And even though it wasn't directly about Bitcoin, because at that time it was more focused on like blockchain and
Mm-hmm.
we had sort of the 2018 sort of all the different tokens that came out. I learned about Bitcoin from there, and what I realized that I loved so much about that was the way it was speaking the language that I had thought about during the crisis, where we saw really a loss of trust in the U.S. dollar and the way the Federal Reserve has been pumping money into our system. That it just has not stopped since the reaction they've had to the 2008 2009 crisis. So I was already thinking back then in '08, man, this is like a real problem. And there's nothing really behind all this money, except keeping the public trust. And with that as a weakness, I think a lot of people then end up realizing the value of Bitcoin, the value that there is trust behind this kind of money. And so I've been accumulating it since 2016.
It's funny you say that because I had an investor in my company back in the late 2000s after the crash, and he's a Wall Street guy, 35 years on Wall Street. And I was worried about just leaving money in like money markets or cash and then his answer was, well, you got to buy the treasury, for your cash position. And I was like, but what if the dollar fails? Like that was my thing. Cause I was really afraid that we were going to absolutely collapse in this country. And I remember him saying to me that, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And the reason for that is we have the strongest military, number one. And number two, well, was just print more of it and you got nothing to worry about. This is what he said. I was like, wait, what? He's like, yeah. He goes, you figure if they're running out of money, they'll just print more of it and you'll get it. And I'm thinking like, but it's losing its value rapidly if that happens. And he's like, eh. And this is like the mindset of that institutional kind of investor class. They're not worried that the dollar. They're actually really not worried that it'll ever collapse. That's just what it tells you. If they're saying just buy it because they'll print more, they're not afraid that it's ever going away.
It's amazing how much we've like evolved as a society, but that type of thinking goes all the way back to Rome of, oh, just take a little of the gold out of the coins and dilute it, and then we can just give more out to the people. Like there's
Sure.
really nothing new on the monetary policy front. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
I had interviewed Alex Gladstein recently, and I read his book, Check Your Financial Privilege. And in the book, he references Wei Dai. In 1995, he sent an email to the cypherpunk list, and he was making the case for technology, not regulation, as the savior of our future digital rights. I just want to read something that it says here. It says, efforts to influence the government, for example, lobbying, propaganda, they're important only insofar as to delay its attempted crackdown long enough for the technology to mature and come into wide use. So let's, with that said, dive into all the regulatory environment and the near term and long term kind of impacts that it may or may not have on Bitcoin, because I think I agree with that. Like in the long term, and I'm sure you do too, Bitcoin will win. It's going to always rise to the top. But the government can really hamper the adoption rate, I think. And a lot of our Bitcoin friends, the more maximalist friends that we have, they'll say Bitcoin doesn't need regulation. Bitcoin doesn't need this or that. And it's like, you're right. But you may be dead by the time it gets to adoption if that's the case. These governments can put a lot of headwinds in front of us. And that brings us to what we're talking about today. So on March 9th, President Biden issued the executive order tasking all the experts across the federal government with conducting an in-depth analysis to balance, basically to look at all the different risks of cryptocurrencies. And there's a variety of different agencies that are in there. So let's talk about that executive order and what the intent really is, in your opinion, and what do you think they're all working on here?
Sure. So the executive order was very much a whole of government approach, which is in a way kind of the way China's approached its cryptocurrency since 2017, where they've had everybody focused on how this digital currency could come about. Obviously, the goal in China was a lot different. So when we talk about a whole of government approach, that means look at it from a complete like resource perspective, like, when they part of the executive order wants to better understand the energy use, of Bitcoin, which has obviously been such a topic in terms of
Mm.
energy FUD, and we've heard about it so much for the year, but it's made its way into, the Office of Science Technology Policy is looking at what is the energy consumption, and does that work against perhaps Biden's goals for climate change? That's been something his administration's been really focused on. It focuses on the risks around cryptocurrencies from a systematic risks, how there might be systemic risks in the system that FSOC, which is the Financial Services Oversight Council, has to look at ever since the 08-09 crisis. And one of the things they've thought about is cryptocurrency as sort of an alternative financial market going to create a systemic risk that's going to spill into the regular financial system and cause the financial system to fail somehow. There's a lot of focus on what they call an urgent need to develop a CBDC, or central bank digital currency. So you have that very much on the table, a push really to the Federal Reserve and just in general, this idea that maybe we need to see a central bank digital currency introduced, because it's sort of like they're seeing this great idea of Bitcoin and everything, and they're
Mm-hmm.
saying, it sounds really good. Let's do the same thing, but
Let's
just
copy it.
let's fiat it, right? I mean, Bitcoin's open source, so why not? Actually, it's really interesting. The National Institute of Standard and Technology, you can actually go to the website. They actually did a GitHub where they did a fork of Bitcoin to try to show the Federal Reserve how you could actually use Bitcoin for money in the United States, and have people who would actually vote on how much is released in the system. It was sort of a fork, so you could do more, but they're really looking at the whole idea of digital currency because it's picking up. I mean, the one article that was referenced, and it's funny to talk about Wei Dai and the idea of like, I feel more like a defensive linebacker now than a quarterback, right? Trying to keep keep the politics at bay. But it's really important the way they're thinking about this, because they're thinking if they can introduce a CBDC. It's almost like a lot of people who've come before and thought if they can introduce an altcoin, or Facebook
Yep.
can introduce something,
Yep.
they can just make it really attractive, and then everyone will maybe just forget about the other ones.
Yeah, I think, and when we were going back and forth in emails and stuff, you had said that they're tasked with guiding by 6 policy objectives, which you kind of touched on some of them. It's first, protect the consumers, investors, and businesses; then safeguard stability, financial stability from systemic risks, as you just were kind of talking about, mitigating national security risks, promoting U.S. leadership and economic competitiveness, promoting equitable access to safe and affordable financial services. This is, I guess, their mandate here that they had for this, right? Supporting reasonable technological advances. This is the CBDC kind of argument, which take account of important design considerations for those related to privacy, human rights, climate change, you talked about. It says over the next 6 months, the Treasury will work with colleagues in the White House and other agencies to produce foundational reports and recommendations related to these objectives. And in many cases, the work tasked by the executive orders build upon ongoing efforts of the Treasury. I heard like a year ago, I was going through some research doing this interview. I saw Jay Powell was interviewed, CNBC interview. And he had said they're already, like you said, working on a CBDC. Like they're literally not just doing research, but like you said, they forked it. They actually have programmers doing stuff. I was surprised by that. I didn't see that when that first came out. And when I heard recently, I think it was on, here it is, March 25th, Yellen was on CNBC with Sorkin. And this one was this stuck out. This really, really kind of stood out to me. These comments that I just want to read the transcript here for a second. So Sorkin said that Russia, which we saw recently, said that they may accept Bitcoin as payment, and asked what her thoughts were on that. And she said, her quote, "Well, crypto has obviously grown by leaps and bounds, and it's now playing a significant role, not really so much as a transaction," she means medium of exchange, right? "But in investment decisions of a lot of Americans." Basically, people are speculating on Bitcoin, she's saying, right? And crypto. She says, "The president just issued a couple of weeks ago the executive order that we just talked about, and is tasking us with other agencies and thinking about the regulation of crypto." Which we'll dive more into this. Then Sorkin says to her, "Does that mean that you're less skeptical now that you have been in the past?" She says, "I've been a little skeptical because I think that there are valid concerns around crypto, and some have to do with, again, like the executive order, financial stability, consumer investor protection, the use of it for illicit transactions and other things like that." But on the other hand, she said, and this is where the Bitcoin community and folks on Twitter and stuff I saw were saying that, like, look, they're bullish on this. I'm not hearing it the same way, right? So on the other hand, there are benefits to crypto, and we recognize that innovation in the payment system can be a healthy thing. So I think they see it as a technology that they can copy, like you just said, right? They're just seeing it as like, oh, this is great. It's more efficient. It's 24-hour settlement. This is awesome. Instant settlements, 24. But that they're just misunderstanding what's really going on here. I don't think they, or maybe they fully understand it and they just want the crypto CBDC of their own so they can control us. What do you think their intent is here with the CBDC? Because I'm hearing her say CBDC, CBDC, CBDC without saying CBDC.
Yeah. Look, I think that it's been about CBDC since day one, and there's no surprise to that. If you go back to some of Yellen's comments early on, and that's really wise of you to point that out, Jay, she has said she thinks that CBDC is the answer. In fact, Powell has testified saying he thinks if we introduced a CBDC, it would make the stable coins and other cryptocurrencies probably, reduce in their value and reduce in
Yep.
their purpose. And in a sense, you kind of have this really all-star team, right? Because Yellen was at the Fed. She knows what's happening from the Fed. Now she's positioned in Treasury, so she could help with the promotion of it and distributing it. And at the end of the day, I think in fairness to Yellen or anyone who's Treasury Secretary, your job is the U.S. dollar and how to keep the U.S. dollar dominant. And there's foreign policy, state Department of State implications, a lot of implications if, let's say, the dollar just suddenly decreased, right, and value, or in its ability to conduct sanctions. And in a sense,
Mm.
we've seen that real time with
Mm-hmm.
people's concerns, whether true or not, of how Russian oligarchs might be using cryptocurrency to help with that. So there's quite a bit at stake. I do think what is key about what she said is the idea of the innovation. This has been a key word since
Yeah.
2016, and it started at the OCC, and it's called responsible innovation. A lot of people don't like that word, it's like, what do you mean responsible? But I think that they're saying, yeah, and when they talk about a payment system, if you look at what the paper was from the Fed and Powell, that when he put that paper out, people can still respond to, by the way, on what they think about what a CBDC might look like from the Fed. Their main purpose in it is a payment system, right? That's a lot. And that makes you think about kind of like, with this space, well, what are we really calling money, right? Is the purpose of a CBDC a medium of exchange so you and I
Right.
can pay each other for goods and services over the internet now? And is that really what we're talking about, or are we talking about preserving cash? I mean, there's a whole many different ways to look at what money's about. We go all the way back to the Civil War. Money was about giving out greenbacks to people so the North could win the war against the South, right? It wasn't really about like a medium of exchange. It was just we needed to get, fund the government somehow. And so we're kind of at a point now where there is no other alternative. Sorry, Bitcoin Tina, but I
Tina.
think for them there's no other alternative than a CBDC, and that's why their first focus, if you remember, was on stablecoins, right? The whole paper on stablecoins, because that's the closest replica to what a CBDC might look like. So that's actually more of a threat to them than Bitcoin, because that could be used as a payment system. In fact, it kind of already is today.
But here's the thing, right? Like they're going to create a CBDC. People might, it's like obfuscation, right? They'll be like, why do I need UST or USDC? And you probably don't. You could just use the dollar, I guess, because if that's pegged to the dollar and they're pegged to the dollar, then they're both the same and one and the same. There is some issues potentially though, with they can control you, they can cut you off, like we're seeing them do to other countries. By the way, oligarchs, I'm air quoting for those listening, right? Like, what is an oligarch? Is Warren Buffett an oligarch? I don't know. I would say he is if you were outside this country because he's influenced policy decisions. In 2009 or 2008, he was the one that came in and said, I think we need to do the bailouts.
Mhm.
And then when they did the bailouts and everything started crashing prior to that, or around that time, who was there to save Goldman Sachs with their special warrant purchases and stuff? Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. So if you were outside this country, you would say that if you characterize the Russian oligarchs that way, why isn't he considered an oligarch, right? And if we weren't the world's reserve currency, what could others do to people like him? So I think what's happening right now is a slippery slope in the world is what I'm kind of leading to. And if you give them that power and you let that dollar persist as a CBDC, they can control your purchasing. They can cut you off like they're doing up in Canada on people freezing assets. It's pretty dangerous, you know?
Yeah, and that's to their own people, right? It used to be
Yeah.
more about sanctions, and the US got into the business of regime change. And, you know, hopefully, like maybe Bitcoin becomes that pharmaceutical drug that they realize is the right way to approach foreign policy, because the way we do sanctions now, and I mean, yeah, I know you just said Alex Gladstein on it, so that's his I don't want to steal anything from him, but it really is pretty awful. It's almost like when we used to have people who had anxiety issues, the answer was, well, just do a lobotomy. If you think about it, like we have a problem with another country, we're just going to make everybody in that country starve, even if like 99% of the people aren't responsible.
Yep.
And that's really rough. And that's the way we're using the dollar now. It's weaponizing the
Hmm.
money that we have in our system to power play a country to do what we want them to do.
Yeah,
And the resounding answer to why we're doing that is, well, we're saving, soldiers' lives. Well, yeah, we're
yeah,
saving American soldiers' lives, but it's at the cost of other lives.
that's
Maybe there's a
exactly right.
new way we can advance as a society to conduct our foreign policy that doesn't have to result in just the automatic loss of life, or at least a lot of hardship for people who are totally innocent.
Yeah, I mean, look what's happening in parts of the world. They're literally rioting right now over food scarcity issues and not being able to afford the food, right? So, and I was saying in like February when they did what they did with the sanctions and this, I thought, wow, this could get a little ugly. And here we are, a couple months later, it's starting to get a little ugly. Now, the argument is, well, we have to sanction them because what about the people in the Ukraine? People are dying. Yes, but there might be more people that actually die as a result of the sanctions and the food scarcity issues globally. They're just in parts of the world that we're not hearing about. That's what's happening, right? Their prices are rising up and they have no relief. And and people in the US aren't seeing it or feeling it really because, like as Gladstein would say, check your financial privilege. Like as poor as you may feel you are in the United States, you're pretty wealthy globally.
Yeah, I feel privileged just to like be on a podcast, being able to talk about it. It's such a good reminder. His book, but it's almost like at this point, like if like you were the HR department, it's almost like you need to bring the United States and like, look, we got to talk about your job description and what you're trying to do around the world. Like you can't be going around trying to just regime change everything. And a lot of that was spurred from sort of the Cold War playbook and concerns about nuclear weapons. And I don't know what the answer is. Obviously, there's Jason Lowery, Space Jason, that's on Twitter a lot, and he talks a lot about his ideas with the kinetic warfare. But at some point or another, it's clear the mandate, right? The mandate has become that the Senate and the House are moving toward. We can't have things like ransomware that would shut down our country. That's an attack on the U.S. And we can't have things like sanctions be impacted. And there was a bill about El Salvador called the ACES Act, the Accountability in El Salvador for Cryptocurrency, Accountability for Cryptocurrency in El Salvador, sorry, ACES Act, and it was by Senator Menendez in your state, Senator Menendez, New Jersey. And I'll tell you, he's one, when we talk about trying to talk to politicians, he's one that would be good to talk to because he's the one that actually started looking at this in 2018, Jay, with when the petro was used in Venezuela. And he talked about we have to do sanctions, and he wanted more studies done of what this will mean to changing the sanctions framework. The ship has really sailed and he's right to pay attention to it because with the way cryptocurrencies work and are
Oh, you cut
impacting
out.
the world, I don't
You
think
there?
you can rely on fiat currencies. You can't really rely on them for their value much anymore. But more importantly, I don't think you can necessarily rely them on sanctions. There's a lot of other effects from the sanctions, like you talked about, causing other effects like people starving and everything, where it's just not working. That play in the playbook may just not exist anymore. And so we're going to have some really smart folks think about what the foreign policy issues are in the U.S. We're not going to if we're going to find a way to avoid sort of some catastrophic things that, as people in our community think maybe there needs to be some pain in the world as we sort of adopt new money. But this adoption of new money is coming. The CBDC to me is the surrender. In 2018, the Bank of International Settlements said that all the central banks should ban Bitcoin. Now they're trying to clone Bitcoin. So in a sense, it's we're at that point of there's no more denial about it. It's more just trying to live with it and what can they do to live with these new cryptocurrencies.
On March 11th, the U.S. Office of Financial Asset Control reminds the U.S. citizens that Bitcoin, just like the U.S. dollar, is covered under the sanctions against Russia. Why is that important?
Yeah, well, it was kind of understood that was before, but it's pretty clear Treasury took the signals from the White House executive order, and it's 2 days later that people need to understand in the U.S. that if you're a cryptocurrency exchange, your responsibilities are no different than if you're a bank. And I think this goes to the point you were saying before, Jay, because you were talking about how there's all these things about like businesses are affected, consumers are affected. What if there's, illicit transactions happening? That's the framework that the Treasury's used to as far as the way banks work, right? They're supposed to report this data in to organizations like FinCEN, make sure, terrorists aren't using the money that's really since been 2001, right, with 9/11. And before that, it was money laundering from sort of the drug wars. So we're in a framework where OFAC is saying anything that's outside of that bank framework that involves reporting on financial transactions where we can't check it to make sure there's not going to be a catastrophic 9/11 is a problem. And so I think that's the first sort of shot across the bow, if you will, at how they want to bring these cryptocurrencies under, very strict banking regime, which has not gone well. Like if you look in China and other places, we were talking before, like if we want adoption of Bitcoin to happen, this would be my argument with Wei Dai, as from the political angle of this is, yes, you're absolutely right. The technology can win, but if we don't have the concepts understood that they need to look at Bitcoin in a different way than they're looking at regular finance, they could slow things down significantly, if they wanted to. I think the good news is the U.S. has a lot of Bitcoin already, right? I think they're gathering a lot from some of the seizures, but just in general, I think they're going to realize they're going to have to treat it like something like gold. It's more like just coaching them toward understanding what this new thing is that's moving into their ecosystem, and how to, not just how to live with it, but how to like have the U.S. prosper with it, because Bitcoin is really this decentralized system. Even when they set up the Federal Reserve, they thought of it as a decentralized or distributed system because they had 12 different branches all over the country to help. If you're sending a check from San Francisco, it can be cashed in New York, and they know how to route it correctly. It was sort of that same approach. So I think, understanding the democratization values of Bitcoin and why like countries like China have basically kicked it out was what should make America embrace it and be like the best country on the planet to own Bitcoin. So I think it's going to just take a lot, though, to help them understand that when they talk about these things. Like, because when you see OFAC, what they're saying is they don't care if it's Bitcoin or the dollar. Don't help Russia right now because we're doing the sanctions thing and we're behind Ukraine.
Yeah, and then on March 19th, about a week after that, Senator Elizabeth Warren announced the new bill, which was, I want you to go over this, the Digital Asset Sanctions Compliance Enforcement Act of 2022. So explain what that is and how that may impact Bitcoin.
Sure. There's about 11 senators that have co-sponsored this bill that would look to enhance and review how communication protocols, and that's what's used in the bill that's key. And there's another term in that bill that talks about if you're facilitating a transaction. And it's funny, it goes all the way back, Jay, to when I remember you were talking about that bill that got everyone's attention with the crypto tax bill.
Yeah.
And it was, I don't remember what it was, but it was something about facilitating a transaction, or when you use a certain word in a lawsuit, there's like this idea of like they're getting at something. So what is a digital asset, transaction?
Yeah, the vagary of the terminology, it's all about interpretation in law, right? So you got to really, words have meaning, like
right. So this
dramatic meaning. Yeah.
This bill, which by the way, since we last talked, Representative Brad Sherman, who's been no friend of Bitcoin, has introduced a complementary bill in the House and gotten about 15 people to co-sponsor that bill. And so what it really does is it opens up for interpretation in the law, to your point, that things like Bitcoin and Ethereum would literally have to go through the same types of sanctions requirements that everything else would. And the problem with that and the practicality of that when we talk about communications protocols is, where does that stop? That's a slippery slope. Does that mean the programmer designing, the Bitcoin core folks are responsible? Are the miners responsible? Who are we saying is responsible to stop? If I sent you a Bitcoin right now, right, there's no stopping it. It's going to happen. And so I don't know, Bitcoin doesn't fit again into that world. But it has a lot of Democrats. It doesn't necessarily have Republicans co-sponsoring it. And with the way things are right now, they do have a 50-50 Senate, but they do have the House. So it might very well get out of the House because it has a lot of support. But it's also something that's a little bit redundant because the president can do an executive order on this now. So it's almost not necessary.
Sure.
I'd say the big takeaway for your listeners and in general is This was an executive order that could have been a lot harsher. People in our space always like to talk about 6102 and banning gold. It could have been a ban on Bitcoin, right? It could have been, they're at least giving us all the opportunity to sort of study it and think about it. It's a very lightweight kind of executive order. It's really just having all the agencies be hyper focused on it and come up with a plan.
Do you think the reason they're not going for the ban is that they are aware that the constituents that vote for them own Bitcoin? Like 50 something to 60 million Americans now own some type of a cryptocurrency, whether it's an NFT, crypto, or Bitcoin. So maybe they're like, I don't know if I really want to get too aggressive here because I might really piss off my voters.
Yeah, it means a lot. Like especially when the think tanks in DC, inside the Beltway, start to come out with numbers. Like they quote the Pew Research Center, which is a highly respected think tank, and that shows that 16% of all Americans have touched cryptocurrency in some way already, whether for a payment or whether for holding it. And so when they look at that, they have to realize that people are working with this. So it might cause more backlash than they intend. They ultimately have to serve the voter. I don't know that the Bitcoin voting block is that powerful yet,
Sure.
but it's amazing that hearing all the talk, because I think we're at a point where we could see, and it's amazing the community like the Bitcoin Policy Institute is great. That was just Bitcoin Policy Group that was founded by David Zell, and it was from out of the Bitcoin conference. I mean, they're really starting to make a mark. The work that CJ is doing, with the BTC Bitcoin
Mhm.
Today Coalition, I'm starting to see what I think you could historically reference to something like an AARP or an NRA. I hate the NRA because it's more just one partisan group, but really from a bipartisan perspective where we're all working together as a community. And, that's the one way that you can really defend against like, big business interests, right? Or Wall Street interests in the lobbying game is if you have a grassroots, movement that help can, stick together.
I mean, last summer, you said the voter block's not that big, but I mean, last summer, a lot of people called in when they issued whatever the bill we were just talking about before, right? So, but a lot of people called in and then they kind of like about faced, right? It was like, whoa, wait a second. A lot of people are calling in here to the senators across the country.
Oh yeah, no, that was absolutely it, and it showed that it existed. What I think we're going to watch now is the consolidation of sort of, we're still early days of like, how is this all going to work, right? Who's going
Yeah.
to run this? Like, who's going to be the, ARP? Like,
You like to your point though, you don't want it to be NRA one party, right? It seems to be moving more towards Republican and the right for a variety of reasons. One of which the senators like Cruz and stuff are down in Texas, and with the energy down in Texas with the oil companies and the gas flares, and it's very beneficial, and they're going to have a lot of economic growth probably as a result of it. So they see it from that perspective. But then anytime you see one side starting to move first, the other side always wants to put their heels in the sand and say, nope, no, no, we're going to make this a partisan issue, and that's the risk here.
yeah, and I think you saw that, it was bipartisan for the most part with Facebook.
Yeah.
But then it started to divide when the idea of Bitcoin was brought up. Um, and the one thing that I'll say is unfortunate, is that the far right sort of has been trying to embrace Bitcoin too, right? And we've seen sort of this idea of like now where Bitcoiners could be painted as like, the just really on the outskirts. And the truth is, there are Democrats. I mean, Senator Lummis working with Senator Gillibrand and her publicly announcing. I mean, she's a Democrat working on a bipartisan bill to help with regulation around the whole crypto space. That's really big. So there are hope. I think there are Democrats who maybe are really like Bitcoin, like Ro Khanna and the others, and but they just don't talk about it that much, and they
Mhm.
really can't because the party line right now is very focused on this EO, and there's also focus about this whole energy thing, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens.
That leads me to the next thing, March 24th.
Yep.
About 2 weeks after the executive order, a request for information by the White House was asking about climate change impacts of proof of work consensus mechanisms. Um, I think you sent me back and forth in emails. You said folks have until May 9th to respond, and anyone in the public can send in their comments. Why don't we talk about that right now? Because I think Senator Lummis and others are announcing a bipartisan bill or have announced bipartisan bill related to this as well.
Yeah. So, in terms of the announcement about the RFI, so request for information is typically done by any U.S. agency. In this case, it's literally the White House, and it's their Office of Science, Technology, Policy. And yes, you do have till May 9th to respond. And I encourage every Bitcoiner to respond. This to me is a decision to respond. And if you reach out to me, I can help you with it. But you should, because it's the same thing as if you vote or don't vote. Because what they're studying is the amount of energy consumption that Bitcoin uses. And the reference points are things from the Digiconomist and the Cambridge Center of Alternative Finance. They don't really have any other reference points right now. So there really needs to be evidence if miners want to show things about the stranded energy use, right? The solar and wind, the fact that the large majority of the energy that's used is renewables. I think it was a plus for us sort of moving out of China because there was a lot of coal used, but more importantly, the amount of energy used for Bitcoin versus other things, like we can do this comparison game all the time. And I think,
Mm.
unfortunately, what we've seen it evolve into is sort of like, if I'm like driving down the street and I'm in like my hybrid vehicle and you're driving by me in a Hummer, it's sort of that value judgment of, wait a minute, you're guzzling
Virtue
all this
signal.
gas. Like, why use Bitcoin, when you could use something less, but it's so early. It's a little too early for this conversation. But what's important is this is your opportunity to actually send to the White House your thoughts or any evidence that you want to provide from any state, from your mining activities, to help explain to them why mining and the way it uses electricity is not as bad as it's been made out to be, and why perhaps switching from one consensus mechanism that we know is working to another maybe isn't necessarily the answer. So they're giving everyone an opportunity to respond, and I commend them for that. I think this is where the answer is not just all in technology, but if you have a country where, look at all the countries that just ban it outright and people don't even have a vote or a voice. Here you have a chance to have a voice and put yourself on record by submitting to this RFI by May 9th with your thoughts about the energy usage behind Bitcoin.
And it is really BS because I'm just going through some old tweets that I have. I was trying to find it while you're saying this. There's so much energy FUD on Bitcoin, but like air conditioning accounts for a fifth of the total electricity in buildings around the world, or 10% of the global electricity consumption. But nobody ever would talk about that because they want to be nice and cool.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think Christmas lights in December is like more than Bitcoin mining at the current in the United States. Right. It's incredible, but there's nobody talking about that as well. So there's a lot of misdirection, and you got to understand what is the real, why do you think that they really believe? Do you think that it's probably a combination, nothing's ever so binary, right? But do you think it's a combination of those that don't really understand, that are senators and stuff, those that do, that feel like that it's a threat to the government, so maybe they're just obfuscating and stuff? Like what do you think's really going on here?
Well, I think there's an open mind in this case because with the Office of Science, Technology, Policy in the White House, I mean, it's run by Dr. Alondra Nelson. And so you have scientists, right? Top scientists who are really evaluating the evidence. And that's what I'm saying, where the only reference point, the only evidence really that's been provided about Bitcoin so far has like not been in its favor. So this is where we need to provide some evidence about why, we kind of have to be on the defense, but explain what it is, how the energy in the Bitcoin system works in the first place, right? How over time, what it's accomplishing and what we want it to do. And look, we can make comparisons all day. We can compare the way the Federal Reserve has gotten us in a mess the last 14 years versus like the Bitcoin, beginning of a potential mess, like environmentally. Like there's all kinds of considerations. And I would say too, this is really something specific to the Biden administration. We don't know what this will look like, in 2024. We're hyper focused on this ESG narrative, but I think we have to be realistic because the last thing we want to do, using their words about harming, responsible innovation, is chill innovation because of the idea of, well, how much energy might it use? It's really been too early of an argument, and I don't think should be a determining factor. You know, I don't even know like what the energy usage would be for, like, let's say, a central bank digital currency, right? With the rate of speed they want to do it, and if they want it to be really effective, what they really need to be thinking about is what the community has come up with, which is solving the double spend problem, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they had to figure out a way to do that. And if you want to come up with your own digital money, right now Bitcoin shows to be, the king. So,
I found an old tweet here from CJ, actually. This is May of last year. It says Bitcoin uses less than 0.1% of human energy production worldwide. Bitcoin consumes 0.25% of the energy wasted.
mhm.
So it is a lot of fun.
I, I, I worry. I'll say this, Jay. Like, I worry a lot about when I hear arguments like this, because to me, when you're starting to lose the battle, right? When Bitcoin was really growing, was shooting up towards 60,000, and then all of a sudden we started hearing about the energy use. That's when the detractors will always find certain angles. And like nothing surprises me anymore. Like that, if you notice, the New York Post had that terrible headline about like the psychopaths use Bitcoin or something, right? And it was a Queensland study from Australia, and the tetrad, the four different traits, were all these like that. And that's what I mean when there's the far right using it, is so the energy, maybe they're starting to realize, well, the energy thing really isn't working. So let's just make sure everyone thinks Bitcoiners are crazy. They won't
They're
want
just
anything to
nuts.
do with this. And so
Dismiss them, please.
yeah. And to be honest, when you're debating, right, you start to get these ad
Yeah,
hominem attacks, then you're winning, right? Because they're not arguing about the facts of Bitcoin and what it does. They're just
for
arguing
sure.
about what they think the personality type is or what they think the energy usage might be. And so, if we want to talk about sustainability, the heart of the matter that Bitcoin came out with in 2008, we're talking about the sustainability of money, right? Of what we're going to be using for value for our kids, for our grandkids. That's what's on the line. It should not be something that's, to me, is a short-sighted thing. There's so many other things that we could probably be doing better as far as from an environmental standpoint than worrying about what we should be doing, which is creating better money and perhaps a better, monetary system than we have now. Like, no one wants to take a step back and say, maybe we should reconsider the way we do monetary policy.
Totally agree with you, Jason. I want to be respectful of your time, so I want to stop it here for this session. I definitely want to have you come back on again. We'll talk about where we are on the other side of this in a few months, as these things start to materialize. And if you could just tell everybody where they can find you, if they want to reach out to you, based on some of the comments you made earlier of how they can help.
Sure. My Twitter handle is @regulatoryjason, and it can be reached at www.valuetechnology.org or jason@valuetechnology.org, which is the nonprofit that I use to help with a lot of these thought pieces and help with influencing the debate in Washington, D.C. around all this.
And are you
So
going to be in any conferences coming up, or any places that people can find you and meet you in person, possibly?
I'm in DC once a month, so I don't necessarily have any conferences planned right now. But yeah, I'll be up in May. I'm always happy to meet with people and discuss, particularly as we have these new bills that are being introduced.
Cool. Jason, thanks again for coming on. We've been trying to do this for months, so we'll got to have you come back again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.